So let's move on now and implement the edit activity class. Now we're going to reuse the same layout file that we created for the add activity, so that's going to make it a little bit easier for us. And we're going to actually copy and paste a lot of the code from add activity because it is very similar, so this shouldn't take that long. So let's make a start. Okay, so here we are. We're going to create the new class. New class. We're going to call it edit activity. And just like the add activity, we're going to do an extends fragment activity. Now what we're going to do, because so much of this code is the same, we're just going to copy and paste and make a few subtle changes. And I do always recommend that where possible, if you have got the ability to do that, copying and pasting can be a good idea because it just saves a lot of time, but it can introduce errors. So you do want to make sure when you're copying and pasting that you're only putting in the things that you need. You're not actually just copying a whole block of code that perhaps isn't going to get used, because that's how, when you hear what code bloat is, when you hear applications that are bloated and huge, that's what's happened. They've actually had a lot of copying and pasting, and there's functions that have been reused, or haven't been reused, but they've been added time and time again. Okay, so let's change the add activity there to edit activity. All the other fields are going to be the same because, again, it's very similar as I mentioned. And we're going to copy the add create method as well, or the on create I should say. We're going to copy the whole method. I'm going to paste it in. But we need to make a few changes to it. So firstly, the add edit is the same because remember we're reusing the same view. And all this code here, well, we need to change the content resolver obviously because it's going to be edit activity and not add activity. The button's going to be the same, and all these IDs are the same because of course we're reusing the same XML. Save button's going to be the same as well. Then when we get into the set on click listener, we're not going to have a valid check here, so we're going to delete that. And then we need to delete the code that ends the block, and we'll just tidy that up a bit like so it fits better. Then we need to change the URI, but we'll also need to change the insert method because we're not doing an insert this time. We're going to be actually doing an update, and of course to do the update we need to pass an ID. In the case of adding a record, we didn't have an ID, and that's because the ID is generated when the record is saved. But in the case of doing an update, where we're updating an existing field, we need to send the ID that we're working on to the process. And of course, the other thing we need to do is we also need to populate the fields on the screen, because again, in the case of adding, we didn't have any data, so we didn't need to display anything on the screen. The contents were blank. But in the case of editing, there is a difference. We do actually have to pre-populate those fields, and we also have to record our ID so that we can use that when we're doing the update. And just to make that clear, if we go to Friends Custom Adapter, here's the code here. You notice the edit activity is now working. You remember this code that we added in a previous video. So we're actually passing the ID, the name, the phone, and the email. We're passing all that information to the edit activity class. So what we need to do in the edit activity class is we need to retrieve the intent and get those values out and pre-populate the fields as I mentioned. So to do that, we're going to introduce some code here after the content resolver. So I'm going to type intent equals get intent. So we're not creating a new object, we're getting the intent that's been passed to this activity. So we now need to retrieve it. So we're going to do final string ID. We need the final incidentally because we're putting the values in the onClick method, and because that's an inner class we actually have to use final. That's a prerequisite from Java. That's why we're doing that. The final string equals intent.get string extra, and of course the first one is friends columns dot friends ID, and it's only the ID that's going to be going into the inner class. The other three fields, name, phone, and email, we don't actually have to put them into the class because we're just saving them into the text views. And of course what will happen then is if the user updates them, the updated values get retrieved when we do a get text. So we don't need a final, so we're just going to do string name equals intent dot get string extra, and it will be friends columns dot friends name. And likewise for phone and email, phone, email, phone, email. So we've now got the 4 bits of information from that's been passed to this activity. Now we need to set the fields, set the text views with what the names are. Now I'm actually calling them text views, but from memory they're actually edit views, edit text, aren't they? So what we need to do now is we put m name text view dot set text, and it'll be name. So we're saving that into the screen, into the layout. M phone text view dot set text phone, and m email text dot set text email. So the values on screen will now be showing in the fields on the screen in the edit text, so that we can actually manipulate those later. And then the listener itself, again I mentioned that the string ID had to be a final, and that's because that's the only one of those 4 that we're going to be using in this inner class. So what we want to do now is we want to do what we've done before, exactly the same. We're creating a new content values, because again this click has happened, or was coming after the user has clicked save, so they've made their editing changes. So we need to then retrieve the data that's in those fields, whatever, that might be exactly the same as we've populated with up here, or it could have been updated by the user, but either way we've got to retrieve those, which we've done there. Then we need to update this method here, this URI returned, to use the update method instead of the insert as I mentioned before. But what we've got to do is we've got to do something a little bit different. So we're going to put URI equals friends contract dot friends dot build friend URI. So we're going to build that URI which we've done, you've seen elsewhere, for the ID. And that's so that we know which record we're going to be dealing with. So then when we update it, we put int returned equals, because it's not a URI that's returned now. So the int returned, we put records updated, would probably be a more accurate way of putting it on there. And that will show how many records have been updated. In theory, there should only be 1, but we won't know that. We're going to put URI there now, because we've built the URI. We put values. And there's a selection clause and the where clause. We're not going to do that because the URI has already specified and told us the exact record, but based on that ID, so we don't need to go any further. You might use that in some cases where you want to do a bulk update. In other words, you want to update more than 1 record at a time. But in our case, we can pass those as null. And we can just do a debug. We can put number of records updated, which should always be 1 because we've set the ID as a primary key. So in reality, it should only ever be 1. We could put records updated just so we've got something in our log anyway. Delete that. Then of course we need to change add activity. After we've done that, we get to edit. So that's where we're coming from. And we're going to go to main activity.class, exactly the same. So we're going to leave out the flags this time. We don't need that flag. And just start activity and then finish. So that's literally it. So again, just to recap what we've done here, everything was the same up until the content resolver. We then retrieved the parameters or the arguments that were passed to this activity. We extracted the ID and the name, phone, and email. And again, this came from the Friends custom adapter from this bit of code. That's where the code was populated. And that happens when the user presses edit on the screen, when the edit, which is the little pencil, which you'll see when we go to run the app a little bit later. And so we then populate down here. We then populate the on-screen views with the relevant data that's coming straight out of the database. We assign a save button as we've done before, and we also set up a click listener, which worked very similar to before. We created new content values. We've saved the values that come back from the views. We built a slightly different URI because we needed to pass the ID of the record, so we knew which record from the content provider needs to update, which of course then gets sent to the database. And the records updated should always return 1 in our case because there should only ever be 1 record with the ID, but we just out of interest we're logging that. And once we finish, we go back to the main activity. One last thing we need to put in now, we need to override on options item list selected. That one there. We're going to do a switch item.getItemID. This is if someone presses back on the screen. The home button, I should say. So that's the menu option. And if the menu option happens to be home, so we can do a search for android.r.id. So again, Android, remember, instead of r dot. So Android is looking for something from within Android that's already been specified and not our layouts. In this case, it's looking for the home. So has the home button been pressed? If it has, we're going to do something called navutils.navigate up from same task, this. Now, this is a convenience method, but essentially just allows us to navigate back to the parent method, and it's just a short of syntax. You don't have to pass some extra parameters. We don't have to tell it which the parent is. By doing that, it knows, okay, I'm going to go back to the parent. So in other words, what we're saying here is if someone presses home, we're going to go back to the main menu. Now, I haven't put any validation in here, but that could be an optional exercise for you if you wanted to. You could put some validation. You could maybe use similar for validation to what we did in the add activity, but I'm not going to do that now. So just to finish this off then, we're going to do a break. Now I'm just going to do a return true, just to close off the method. So really only here, the only custom code we've got on the edit activity is if they press home, we're going to go back to the parent, which is in this case will be main activity. Alright, so that's edit activity. So we're getting close to being finished now. We have to then, what we have to do finally is implement the search activity. We're going to be doing that next, but what we can probably do now is try and do a build. Haven't done a build for some time, obviously, because we've had broken code, because we hadn't been implemented, but we've pretty well implemented everything now. The search has to be implemented, but that's probably going to come up with an error. Search activities come up with an error because we haven't created that, but everything else seems to have worked, which is good. And a lot of the errors that we had in the past have now disappeared, so we're looking pretty good. And main activities, I think, is looking at the list over there, is the only thing that's complaining because we haven't got search activity, which we're going to be doing next. I'll see you in the next video, and let's implement search activity.